March 1964. A 38-year-old man with a following of hundreds of thousands discovers that the mentor he called the messenger of God has been living a double life. Within 90 days, he'll be expelled from the only family he's known for 12 years, hunted by former brothers, and forced to rebuild everything from nothing. But in that crucible, MalcolmX would transform from loyal soldier into independent strategist, and the power struggle that destroyed him would expose the fragile architecture of charismatic movements everywhere. This is exactly how it happened. 1952, a 27-year-old ex-convict walks into Temple No. 7 in Harlem with nothing but a prison education and rage at a system that destroyed his family. His name is Malcolm Little. Within months, he won't just join the Nation of Islam. He'll become its most valuable weapon. But here's what most people miss about Malcolm's rise. He wasn't recruited because he was angry. He was recruited because he was systematic. In prison, Malcolm had taught himself to think like a scholar. He'd copied an entire dictionary by hand. He'd read Kant, Schopenhauer, and Hegelian dialectics. He understood something that would make him irreplaceable to Elijah Muhammad: how to translate complex theology into street-level power. The Nation of Islam in 1952 had maybe 400 members nationwide. 12 years later, over 40,000. And Malcolm X was the architect of that expansion. Here's a strategy. He identified every major northern city with a significant black population: Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles. Then he built a template, a reproducible system for turning frustration into faith and faith into organizational loyalty. Temple meetings weren't just religious services. They were recruitment engines. Malcolm would stand before crowds and do something revolutionary. He'd tell them their suffering wasn't their fault, that the system was designed to break them, that they weren't inferior, they were sabotaged. This message was explosive in 1950s America, and Malcolm delivered it with surgical precision. But there was a price for being this effective. Every convert Malcolm brought in, every temple he opened, every newspaper he sold, it all increases value to Elijah Muhammad. And in organizations built on charismatic authority, value becomes vulnerability. By 1963, Malcolm X had become the public face of the Nation of Islam. When Americans saw the movement, they saw Malcolm's face, heard Malcolm's voice, not Elijah Muhammad's. Muhammad was 65 years old, managing multiple households, a fact Malcolm didn't yet know the full implications of. He was watching his protege outshine him in every public forum, and he was beginning to hear whispers from his inner circle. Malcolm is getting too big. The relationship between them was textbook mentor-protege dynamics. Malcolm called Muhammad the messenger. He deferred every major decision. He ended every speech with, "The Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us." He was the perfect soldier. But perfect soldiers pose a unique threat. They remind everyone what loyalty looks like, which highlights when leaders fail to reciprocate it. In late 1963, something shifted. Malcolm began receiving strange signals from Chicago headquarters. Speaking invitations being redirected. His newspaper column facing unusual editorial interference. Phone calls that used to be answered immediately now went unreturned for days. And then came the whispers from secretaries, ex-members, people on the periphery. Elijah Muhammad had fathered multiple children with young secretaries in the organization. Not one scandal. A pattern. For Malcolm, this wasn't just gossip. It was a theological crisis. The Nation of Islam's entire moral authority rested on strict behavioral codes. Adultery was ground for expulsion. Members had been banished for less. If the messenger violated his own message, what did that mean for the movement Malcolm had spent 12 years building? He made a decision that would seal his fate. He went directly to Elijah Muhammad and asked if the rumors were true. Muhammad admitted it, but instead of contrition, he offered Malcolm a rationalization drawn from biblical scripture, the same technique Malcolm had used to recruit thousands. David had Bathsheba, Lot's daughters. The prophets weren't perfect. Malcolm accepted the explanation. Publicly, he remained silent. But privately, he'd crossed a threshold. He'd seen the man behind the message. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. What Malcolm didn't know was that his loyalty in this moment had already marked him as a liability. Because the one thing authoritarian structures can't tolerate isn't betrayal, it's witnesses. Within 8 weeks, the organization Malcolm had built would turn him into its primary target. But the trigger wouldn't be theology. It would be 6 words he said on television, words that would give Elijah Muhammad exactly the excuse he needed. November 22, 1963, 12:30 p.m. Central Time. President John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. Within 48 hours, the Nation of Islam issues an internal directive to every minister, every captain, every temple across America. Do not comment on the assassination. Complete radio silence. Elijah Muhammad knew what MalcolmX didn't yet understand, that in moment of national tragedy, the public demands unity, and any organization that violated that demand would be crushed. Malcolm received the order. He understood the order. And on December 1st, 1963, 9 days later, he violated the order in the most public way possible. Here's what happened. Malcolm was scheduled to speak at the Manhattan Center in New York, a routine speaking engagement. During the Q&A session, a reporter asked him about Kennedy's death, and Malcolm said 6 words that would detonate his entire world. The chickens have come home to roost. He elaborated, of course. He said that Kennedy had done nothing to stop the violence against black people in the South, that America's climate of hate had created this tragedy, and that violence begets violence. But none of that mattered. Those 6 words were all anyone heard, and they were all Elijah Muhammad needed. Now, here's the critical strategic question. Why did Malcolm say it? He knew the directive. He was a national representative. He'd helped draft organizational policy. He understood media dynamics better than anyone in the Nation of Islam. So why risk everything over one comment? The answer reveals something crucial about how power struggles actually unfold. Malcolm was operating with outdated assumptions. He still believed he was the perfect soldier. He still believed that his 12 years of loyalty had built credit he could spend. He still believed the relationship with Elijah Muhammad was what it had been in 1952. But organizations don't stay static. As Malcolm built the nation's public profile, he'd inadvertently built a threat profile. Every newspaper headline with his name instead of Muhammad's. Every television appearance where Malcolm became the face of the movement. Every young member who joined because of Malcolm's oratory, not Muhammad's theology. The secretary's pregnancies weren't just a moral scandal. They were a structural vulnerability, and Malcolm knew about them. That made him a witness. And witnesses in authoritarian systems become liabilities. Within 24 hours of the chickens coming home to roost comment, Muhammad summoned Malcolm to Chicago. Not a phone call, a summons. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. Muhammad told Malcolm he was being silenced for 90 days. No speaking, no interviews, no public appearances. You must be punished, Muhammad said. Malcolm accepted it. He thought it was temporary, a slap on the wrist. He'd be quiet for 3 months. The controversy would die down, and he'd return to work. But here's what Malcolm didn't see. The 90-day silence wasn't about punishment. It was about replacement. The moment Malcolm went silent, Muhammad began elevating other ministers. Louis X in Boston, later known as Louis Farrakhan. He started appearing on television, giving the interviews Malcolm used to give. Other national ministers began receiving the speaking invitations that used to go to Malcolm. The Nation of Islam was testing something. Could the organization function without MalcolmX? Could they maintain membership, generate revenue, control the narrative without their most effective operator? And the answer, over those 90 days, became increasingly clear. Yes. Malcolm spent December 1963 watching from the sidelines as the machine he'd built ran without him. He spent January 1964 receiving reports from loyal members that ministers were being told to distance themselves from him. He spent February realizing that the 90-day silence might not have an end date, and then he made a decision that would force the issue. He started talking again, not publicly at first, privately, to reporters, off the record. He started confirming what they'd been hearing about Elijah Muhammad's personal life, about the secretaries, about the children, about the theological hypocrisy. Malcolm thought he was fighting for the organization's moral integrity. What he was actually doing was handing his enemies the justification they needed. By March 1964, the question wasn't whether Malcolm would leave the Nation of Islam. The question was whether he'd survive leaving it, because the organization he'd spent 12 years building was about to deploy every tactic he taught them against him. March 8, 1964. MalcolmX holds a press conference and announces he's leaving the Nation of Islam to form his own religious organization. To the public, it looks like a clean break, a philosophical disagreement, a peaceful parting of ways. But inside the nation, a different kind of machinery was already in motion, and Malcolm had built that machinery himself. Here's what most documentaries miss about this moment. Malcolm didn't just leave an organization. He left a system he'd spent 12 years perfecting, a system designed to neutralize threats, enforce loyalty, and eliminate dissent. And now that system had one primary target: him. The first weapon was isolation. Within 48 hours of Malcolm's announcement, every minister in the nation received instructions. Any member who contacts MalcolmX will be expelled. Any temple that allows him to speak will be shut down. Any family that maintains ties with him will be investigated. Malcolm had pioneered this tactic in the 1950s. When members violated organizational rules, you didn't just expel them. You severed every social connection they had. You made sure their community understood that maintaining contact meant choosing them over the nation. It was brutally effective, and now Malcolm watched it deployed against him with surgical precision. Phone calls from old friends stopped. Brothers who'd worked beside him for years crossed the street to avoid eye contact. Temple secretaries who'd typed his speeches refused to acknowledge his existence. But isolation was just phase 1. Phase 2 was character assassination. The nation's newspaper, Muhammad Speaks, the same publication Malcolm had built into a 600,000 circulation powerhouse, began publishing articles about him weekly. They didn't call him a traitor at first. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they used something more insidious. They rewrote history. Articles claimed Malcolm had always been power-hungry, that he'd tried to take credit for Elijah Muhammad's work, that his speaking style had been too aggressive, too controversial, that he damaged a nation's reputation. They published old photos of Malcolm with captions suggesting he'd never been as important as he claimed. This is sophisticated propaganda. You don't attack the person directly. You attack the memory of who they were. You make the community question whether their own experience was real. Malcolm understood what was happening. He'd helped develop these tactics. But understanding them didn't neutralize their effect. Then came phase 3, economic warfare. Malcolm had been living in a Nation of Islam-owned home in Queens. It wasn't his property. It belonged to the organization. On March 26th, less than 3 weeks after his departure, the nation filed eviction proceedings. Malcolm had 4 children. His wife, Betty, was pregnant with twins. And now he had 30 days to find housing while every landlord who Googled his name saw headlines about organizational warfare and death threats. The nation knew this would force him into a desperate position. Desperate people make mistakes, and mistakes could be exploited. But there was a 4th phase that Malcolm didn't anticipate, because it violated even the harsh logic he understood. Physical intimidation. Reports started coming in from members still loyal to Malcolm. Fruit of Islam captains, the nation's security force that Malcolm had trained, were being asked pointed questions. Would you be willing to handle Malcolm if instructed? Some refused. Others didn't. On April 13th, someone fired a rifle shot to the window of Malcolm's house while his family slept inside. No one was hurt. No arrests were made. Malcolm knew it wasn't random. This was a message. Your family isn't safe. And if we can reach them once, we can reach them again. Here's the terrible irony. Every tactic being used against Malcolm was one he helped perfect. The isolation protocols, the propaganda techniques, the economic pressure, even the implicit threat of violence against apostates. He justified it theologically for years. Now, he was on the receiving end, and he had to decide, would he fight back using the same methods, or would he try to build something different? The answer would determine whether he'd survive the next 8 months. But Malcolm wasn't just defending himself. While the Nation of Islam tightened the noose, he was building an entirely new organization from scratch, one that would expose the power structure he'd just escaped and threaten it in ways Elijah Muhammad never anticipated. The question was whether he could build it fast enough. March 12, 1964. For days after leaving the Nation of Islam, MalcolmX stands in a rented hotel ballroom in Harlem and announces the formation of Muslim Mosque Incorporated. He has no building, no treasury, no organizational infrastructure. What he does have is a strategy that will change everything. He's going to expose the system by building a better one. Here's the brilliant move most people miss. Malcolm didn't try to replicate the Nation of Islam's structure. He built its opposite. The nation was authoritarian, one leader, absolute obedience. Muslim Mosque Incorporated would be democratic, with elected leadership and transparent finances. The nation was insular, separatist ideology, no coalitions with other groups. Malcolm's new organization would be internationalist, building bridges with civil rights groups, African liberation movements, and Orthodox Muslim communities worldwide. The nation controlled information. Members only read approved materials, only heard approved interpretations. Malcolm opened his organization to debate, discussion, multiple perspectives. This wasn't just idealism. It was tactical. Every structural choice Malcolm made was designed to highlight what the Nation of Islam had become, a personality cult masquerading as religious movement. But there was a problem. Malcolm had spent 12 years teaching Nation of Islam members that Orthodox Islam was corrupted, that the white man's religion had poisoned authentic black Muslim faith. Now he needed to prove that Orthodox Islam was the real thing, and that Elijah Muhammad had been teaching a deviation. On April 13th, the same day someone shot through his window, Malcolm made a decision that seemed insane to his advisors. He would leave his family unprotected in New York and travel to Mecca for Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage. His advisors were right to be concerned. He'd be out of the country for 3 weeks, unreachable, vulnerable. But Malcolm understood something they didn't. He needed spiritual credibility to build what came next. The Hajj transformed him. Not in the mystical way journalists would later romanticize. Malcolm was too pragmatic for sudden conversion experiences. But in Mecca, surrounded by Muslims of every race praying together, eating together, treating each other as equals, he saw a version of community the Nation of Islam had never offered. More importantly, he saw a model that worked at scale. Millions of people from dozens of countries, unified by principles rather than personality worship. No messenger, no single leader demanding absolute loyalty. Just shared values and mutual respect. When Malcolm returned to New York on May 21st, he wasn't just transformed personally. He was armed with a blueprint. Within 2 weeks, he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity, modeled on the Organization of African Unity. Not a religious organization this time, but a political one, deliberately designed so people didn't have to convert to anything to join. They just had to commit to 3 principles: self-defense, economic independence, and political education. This was the real threat to the Nation of Islam. Not that Malcolm was building a competing mosque, that he was building something bigger, a movement that could absorb nation members without requiring them to abandon their faith. You could be Christian, Muslim, atheist, it didn't matter. You just had to believe in black self-determination. Elijah Muhammad understood immediately what Malcolm was doing. He was offering an exit strategy to disillusion nation members. a way to leave without losing community or purpose. But Malcolm's expansion came with costs he couldn't yet calculate. Every public speech made him more visible. Every new alliance made him more threatening. Every article he wrote, every interview he gave, it all added to a target on his back that was growing impossible to ignore. His security team reported increasing incidents, cars following him, unknown men photographing his house, phone calls where nobody spoke, just breathing on the other end. The FBI was watching. The nation was watching. And increasingly, Malcolm had reason to believe other forces were watching too. Forces with resources far beyond what a religious organization could mobilize. On June 28th, Malcolm gave a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem. He spoke for 2 hours about building independent black institutions, about connecting the American civil rights struggle to African liberation movements, about the power of organized communities. It was the same ballroom where, 8 months later, he would be assassinated. Malcolm had done the impossible. Built 2 organizations from nothing in less than 3 months, all while dodging threats from multiple directions. But success made him dangerous in ways he was only beginning to understand. And the more dangerous he became, the more forces lined up an interest in his silence. Permanent silence. July 1964. MalcolmX is living in a reality most people never experience. He knows, with near certainty, that someone is planning to kill him. The only question is who will get there first. The Nation of Islam has made its intentions clear through intermediaries. The FBI has 24-hour surveillance on him, ostensibly for his protection, but Malcolm knows better. And now there are rumors of other interested parties. Government agencies, foreign intelligence, forces that see his growing international connections as a threat to geopolitical stability. But here's what separates Malcolm's final months from a simple tragedy. He kept building anyway. Between July 1964 and February 1965, Malcolm gave over 100 speeches. He traveled to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Ghana, Senegal, Kenya, Tanzania. He met with heads of state, addressed the Organization of African Unity, lobbied to bring charges against the United States for human rights violations. He was constructing something that terrified multiple power structures, an international coalition that connected American civil rights struggles to African liberation movements and positioned them as part of the same global fight against oppression. This wasn't just activism. It was systems-level thinking. Malcolm understood that isolated movements can be crushed, but interconnected movements create accountability networks that are much harder to dismantle. The threats escalated in precise increments. August, more phone calls with breathing on the other end. September, a firebomb thrown at his car while parked outside his home. It didn't detonate. November, his house was placed under constant surveillance, not just by the FBI, but by unidentified vehicles that rotated shifts like professionals. December, Malcolm started wearing a bulletproof vest to public appearances. January 1965. He told a reporter, "They've been trying to get me for over a year now. It's just a matter of time." On February 14th, his house was firebombed while his wife and 4 daughters slept inside. They escaped through smoke-filled hallways. Malcolm wasn't home. He was in Detroit giving a speech. He returned to find his family traumatized and his home destroyed. And here's the detail that reveals everything. The Nation of Islam immediately issued a statement suggesting Malcolm had firebombed his own house for publicity. This is what organizational warfare looks like in its final stage, when the truth doesn't matter anymore, only the narrative. February 21st, 1965. Malcolm arrived at the Audubon Ballroom to speak to the OAU. His usual security detail was mysteriously understaffed. Only 5 guards for a crowd of 400 people. At 3:10 p.m., someone in the audience stood up and shouted, "Get your hand out of my pocket!" A classic distraction technique. As heads turned, 3 men rushed the stage. Malcolm X was shot 21 times. He died before the ambulance arrived. He was 39 years old. 3 men were convicted of his murder. 2 of them, Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam, maintained their innocence for over 50 years. In 2021, 56 years after Malcolm's death, they were exonerated. The prosecution had withheld evidence. The FBI and NYPD had concealed their informant's involvement. The full truth of who ordered Malcolm's assassination remains officially unresolved. But the structural truth is clear. When multiple powerful entities decide someone is too dangerous, the specifics of who pulls the trigger become almost irrelevant. So what can we extract from this story that applies to our lives? 3 strategic lessons that transcend Malcolm's specific circumstances. First, systems outlive intentions. Malcolm built tools for discipline and loyalty. When leadership changed, those tools became weapons of control. When you build systems, ask yourself, what happens if the wrong person inherits this power? Second, visibility is a double-edged sword. Malcolm's effectiveness made him famous. His fame made him threatening. His threat profile made him a target. Success doesn't just attract admirers. It attracts people who benefit from your failure. Plan accordingly. Third, independence has a price, but so does compliance. Malcolm could have stayed silent about Elijah Muhammad's hypocrisy. He could have accepted the 90-day suspension and returned as a diminished, controllable figure. He chose integrity over safety. That choice cost him everything, but it also ensured his ideas survive him. MalcolmX didn't live to see the civil rights victories of the late 1960s. He didn't see the Black Power movement that drew directly from his teachings. He didn't see his autobiography become required reading in universities worldwide, or his face on T-shirts worn by people who never lived through his era. But he understood something that kept him building even when death was certain. Ideas, when structured correctly, survive the death of their architect. That's the real lesson. Not martyrdom. Strategic immortality. MalcolmX proved that even when every institution turns against you, principled strategy can outlast organized power. But the question is, which of these 3 lessons hits hardest for you? The danger of building systems without safeguards? The double edge of visibility and success? Or the brutal choice between integrity and survival? Drop your answer in the comments. Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this documentary added real value to your understanding of power, loyalty, and strategic thinking, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. We're uncovering more brilliant minds whose methods change history and whose strategies can change your approach to building, leading, and surviving in competitive environments. Malcolm's story didn't end in 1965. It's still being written every time someone chooses principle over convenience. See you in the next documentary.